and welcome to today's QDU Academy session. Today, we're going to be looking at the round 4 topic for grade 9 for this year, and that topic is that unemployed youths should be forced to join the military. In this session, we're going to looking at the context behind the debate. So that is everything that is worth researching before you start to write your speeches. Then we're going to look at setup, which is everything that goes in your speeches before your points. And lastly, a couple of tips about how to brainstorm some points. If you would like advice about particular ways to structure points or think about rebuttal, look at the previous videos we've done this year, as most of them have covered these kinds of concepts. And that's why they're not going to be covered in this video to avoid just repeating the same content over and over again. Okay, so we're going to start with the context behind this debate, and this is the issue of what to research beforehand. In any sort of policy debate where the affirmative team is changing the world in some way, and these are identifiable because of the word should in the topic, in general, the big piece of context that you are trying to work out from both sides of the debate is what is the problem that the affirmative team is trying to solve. In this particular debate, there are sort of two potential problems. One of the problems is in the direction of the unemployment, and one of the problems is in the direction of the military. So broadly, it's worth looking at what current problems might exist for both current unemployment rates in Australia, and secondly, about the military, if there are currently areas within the military that are lacking. The three particular questions that I've looked for is the idea of, firstly, what does the military do? This is important for two reasons. Firstly, because if you have a good understanding of what the military does and you can explain all of the things that it is trying to do, it will help you work out if there are things that it is currently not doing particularly well that it could do better if there were more people. If you realize that they have a particular mission that they want to go on, but they're not able to because there just are not enough people, then researching this will help you understand that that might be a problem that you solve. But the second reason that it's useful to look at this is to ask the question of, if we're forcing people to join the military, what would they do in the military? And I think that this is very important because most people's first instincts reading this kind of topic is to think about situations such as war, where people are being forced to enter battles as combatants. But that's not necessarily the only thing that the military does. And so there are lots of other things that a person might be encouraged to do. The other two questions are more in the direction of the unemployment side. This is a question of how many people are unemployed, and specifically, depending on what your definition of youth is, how many people within that age range are unemployed. This will be important, firstly, because it will help you identify if there is a big problem with unemployment, but secondly, how many people you are about to force to join the military, which will help you have some kind of scope for what your benefits to the military are. Secondly, the question of why are people unemployed? This is the kind of big question that I think is quite important because things like unemployment do not necessarily happen out of nowhere. The problem might not necessarily be unemployment. The problem might actually be, for example, lack of jobs or lack of skills. That means that people find it difficult to get employed. These are interesting questions to ask, and if you have a good idea about why people are unemployed, this is useful both for affirmative in thinking about how this policy is going to solve that problem, but also for negative if you're thinking of potential countermodels about what specifically is the problem. Is there a different way that we can solve that particular problem? So I think that at the end of this, the idea is that the big pieces of research you should do are firstly to look up the situation of the Australian military, both in the many things that it does, many things that it might want to do, which will help you identify if there is a problem with it currently that you are going to solve, or if there is not a problem, but it just helps frame what sort of things you're going to be getting people to do. And secondly, you want to look at the context behind unemployment in Australia, how many people are unemployed and what the reasons are, so that you can directly adapt your cases to respond to those reasons. Having looked at the kind of context behind the debate, the next thing to look at is definitions of the topics, definitions of the words in the debate. I think there are a few things in this one. The first is unemployed. This is a big one where there is possibly some room for confusion, specifically in the area of people that are working as students, for the reason that sometimes this counts as an occupation, but not a job, which can make it a bit messy. I think it would be very reasonable for affirmative teams to, for example, suggest that someone that was a full-time student at university did not count as unemployed for the purpose of this topic, and that they were not going to be forced to join the military, presumably because whatever the problem is that you're trying to solve does not apply to someone who is a full-time student. But maybe you think that unemployed specifically means people that do not have a job, and maybe being at university is not a job, it is an occupation, and there's a distinction. Regardless, I think negative teams should be aware that both of those are reasonable definitions, though, and that negative teams should be willing to adapt to whatever the affirmative team's case is, and not, for example, write a whole lot of points specifically about how society is going to get really worse because there are no more full-time students. The second thing is youths. Again, I think this debate probably assumes that people are at least 18 years old, but the affirmative team might set an upper limit of 25, they might set an upper limit of 30, they might set an upper limit of something like 22. All of these are reasonable definitions. As with all kinds of topics, the smaller your number is, so if your number is just 18 to 22, this will help you with some of your arguments, because it will mean that you are like taking people out of society for less time maybe, but maybe it's also going to hurt others of your arguments, because it will mean that people that are over 22 aren't getting all of the benefits, or there are fewer people joining the military. So just be aware that every time you expand or contract your number, it will benefit some of your arguments, it will weaken others of your arguments. Just sort of do a bit of a vibe check if you're an affirmative about what is reasonable, whether it's like 18 to 22, 18 to 25, 18 to 30, all of these kind of feel like reasonable numbers, as would any number in between that range as well. The next thing is forced. Again, just in terms of defining the word forced, this is more a model thing than a definition thing. So we'll get to it on the next slide, but it's probably a word that's worth defining. And finally, military. It's worth defining in terms of all of the things that the military does. And I think it's almost, and again, we'll discuss this on the modeling slide, which is the very next one, but it's probably very important for affirmative to define the military as not just the military as it is involved in like active conflict zones, but all of the many things that the military might do aside from that as well. And as with all of these things, this is a kind of interesting debate in that there are a couple of words that I think there could be different definitions of. But the important thing to remember as the negative team is that whilst it's important to think about the definitions of words, you should always be receptive to a reasonable definition. So even if your first instinct happens to be something slightly different, like let's say that you think youth means 18 to 30, but the opposition's model, the affirmative team's model, just says 18 to 25. If that's a reasonable definition, which I think it is, you have to be reactive to that. So just make sure that you don't write big arguments that rely on a specific definition of things that could reasonably be defined in a couple of different ways. All of the arguments will definitely be about young people. All of the arguments will definitely be about people that have no job whatsoever. Those things will not be contentious. It's just where there's a bit of gray area where you need to wait to see what the affirmative team does. The next thing is about models and countermodels. Affirmative has a few things that they should think about in this kind of debate. The first is, how are you going to compel people to join the military? This is probably not overly complicated, but for example, like worth deliberately saying that you're not going to show up to their house and like arrest them and force them to join the military that way. It's presumably operates in a similar way to other sorts of societal duties like jury duty, is the more likely way that that will work. Other things that are worth thinking about are how long you expect people to be in the military for. Is it the idea that they will just continue to be in the military until they get some other job, or until they hit an age limit and so they can apply for lots of jobs while they are there? Or is it the case that, for example, maybe they will be forced to join for a year and they can't get another job during that time? But at the end of the year, you're going to say that they have learned lots of skills that will make them more employable in the future. There's a couple of different things there. The next thing is, what do you think they will do in the military? It's worth thinking about this both from a just like modeling standpoint, but also a logical standpoint. So you get to choose what you would like them to do in the military to some extent. But obviously it makes logical sense that they would not all be forced to do the same thing. It doesn't make logical sense for a military to send untrained soldiers into battle, because there is no logical motive for the military to just have people die without it achieving any sort of benefit. So that's why logically people probably won't get forced to go to war. But what would they be encouraged to do? Would they be operating as like doctors or engineers or something like that? Would they be training? Would they be actively participating? There's lots of different things here. And so many things that are worth considering in that regard about what you expect them to do. One other thing that teams are likely to have lots of questions about is there a way that you can get a job while you are currently in the military? Very much up to you guys what you want to think about for that particular one. There are pros and cons argument-wise for, I think, any particular choice. I think if you choose that the way it should work is that you can continue to apply to jobs, maybe that's good because it means that if they get a job, they get to leave. They protect some of their freedom. But maybe it's bad because it means people won't actually be paying as much attention to the training in the military. They'll just be paying attention to how soon they can leave. Maybe it's a really bad thing to say that you can't apply to jobs because it restricts more of your freedom, but it's good because it means that you're paying more attention. These are the trade-offs that affirmative teams will need to make. I think you can reasonably go in either direction, and negative teams will have some areas that they can attack with some things, but they can't attack with other things, and that's just the way that models tend to work. In terms of negative teams, this is the kind of debate where I think that you do not need a countermodel. I think that compared to some debates where it's so obvious what the big problem is, and therefore it feels really important that we try and solve that big problem. This is the kind of debate where you can just suggest that this model is going to make society worse. But if you, when you're researching the debate, think, oh, there is actually a really big problem and affirmative will probably solve it, but there is a better way to solve it, definitely go in. Definitely run a countermodel in that instance. But I think compared to some other debates that we've seen this year, this is one of the ones where a countermodel is probably less necessary for having a good case on the negative team. And so, but I guess the one big thing that I would always consider, and I think this is a big piece of feedback for debates that I've seen so far this year, is it's reasonable to tell affirmative teams that there are alternative ways to do things, but you should always be specific about what those alternative things are. And that will help you make sure that you have a really grounded idea of what the alternative is. Awesome. And so the final slide in terms of particular suggestions for this debate is just tips about brainstorming points. In this kind of debate, there are a few different things that are worth thinking about. As always in debates, one of your first questions should be to think about whether there is some kind of moral argument that either team could particularly run. In this particular debate, maybe you're thinking that people have some kind of duty to their country, or maybe you think, if you're on the negative team, that people have some kind of freedom and it's unfair to conscript them to the military. It would restrict their freedom. These are interesting arguments. Make sure if you run these kinds of arguments, you explain how we know that those responsibilities or those duties or those freedoms exist, and then how they apply to this particular debate. The other things to think about are all of the different individuals and groups of individuals that are likely to be affected by this policy. The really obvious one in this debate is people that are going to be joining the military. Pretty big group, they're probably going to be incredibly affected in terms of the intensity on a personal level. They are likely to be the most definite benefits, probably the biggest benefits and the harms that either team will claim. But there are also lots of other groups that you can think about in terms of making sure that you have a really diverse set of arguments. So other things that you might want to think about are what happens to all of the other young people? What happens to the young people that don't get forced to join the military? Or does this change the behaviors of young people to avoid getting conscripted in some way? Is this good or bad? You can look at the people that know the young people. What happens to their parents or their families? Things like that. What happens to the military as a whole? In terms of, does the military become better? Does the military become worse? Other questions about society in general. Does this improve or harm the public's perception of the military is another thing that's possibly worth asking. How does this reflect on people that make policies? How does this reflect on the education system? There are so many different groups that I think could be affected by this policy in various ways. So I think it's the kind of debate where it's very easy for a team to fall into a trap of having especially if you're on the affirmative team, having 2 or 3 different arguments that are all about the various skills that you will learn and how you will become more employable. But actually, these things can often be contracted into one just big argument, and then you can think of a really different group of people or individual that could be benefited at the same time that can then be a very different point. So yeah, look at different groups of people that are affected, look at if there happen to be any particularly strong moral arguments in this kind of debate, and this will help you come up with 4 really different arguments for each of your speakers. And thank you very much for listening and watching this presentation as it's gone so far. Obviously, if you are watching this, it means that you have found the YouTube channel. This is one of our big resources, but also for like further information, if you want like a particular deep dive into any particular debating concept, we also have our Talent LMS program, which your coordinators should have emails about that they can then pass on information to you if you are unsure. And this is a resource that we started this year that sort of replaces our previously existing QDU handbook and can help you have some more sort of personal training if you want to learn more about any of the concepts that we've discussed today, or concepts that your adjudicators have asked you about or given you feedback about in the past. Thank you very much for watching and listening to this. Best of luck for this debate, and best of luck for all of your debates in the future.